Horror. 60 men went down with HMS Perseus. One came back. That single fact is not a legend or a rumor. It is confirmed in the Submarine Book of Remembrance, cross-checked against Royal Navy records, and supported by later physical examination of the wreck. The question that has shadowed this case for decades is not whether John Capes survived. He did. But how, given every documented constraint working against him, survival was even physically possible at all. Perseus was a British P-class submarine, designated N-36, operating in the Mediterranean in the winter of 1941. The war in that theater was deep in its most brutal phase. Italian and German forces held much of North Africa. The supply lines to Malta were under constant pressure, and Allied submarines were running patrols through heavily mined waters around the Greek islands. Kefalonia sits in the Ionian Sea, west of mainland Greece, and the waters around it had been seeded with Italian mines. Perseus was transiting that area when, on 6 December 1941, it struck one of them. The explosion was catastrophic and immediate. The submarine sank. 60 members of the crew and passengers did not survive. What the records document, through Capes' later account and through the wreck itself, is that the stern section of Perseus retained an air pocket after the sinking. Capes, a leading stoker, was among those who found themselves in that section. He was not on watch. He was not at a station positioned for immediate escape. He was in the wrong place on the wrong night. And yet, as it turned out, he was in the only part of the submarine where survival retained any physical possibility at all. To understand what came next, the mechanism matters. Davis Submerged Escape Apparatus, DSEA, was the standard Royal Navy escape system at the time. It was a closed-circuit oxygen rebreather attached to a buoyancy bag, and it was not designed for deep escapes. It had known limitations under pressure. Using it required flooding the escape compartment, equalizing pressure against the sea outside, opening a hatch, and ascending through cold, dark water without panicking, without ascending too fast, and without the oxygen mix becoming toxic at depth. Every one of those conditions had to hold simultaneously. A failure in any single element would have ended the attempt. According to Capes' reported account, he and others in the stern section attempted escape using the DSEA sets available. The depth at the wreck site was later confirmed by divers to be around 50 meters, roughly 170 feet. That figure matters because at that depth, the DSEA was operating at the outer edge of its design parameters. The escape hatch had to be manually operated. The flooding sequence had to be completed in a flooded, pressurized compartment in cold Mediterranean water, in the dark after a mine explosion, with no external assistance of any kind. The margin for error inside that compartment was essentially zero. The isolation was total. Perseus had gone down in waters controlled by the enemy. There was no rescue submarine waiting above, no surface vessel alerted to the position, no signal that could be sent from inside a sunk hull. Whatever was going to happen next had to begin and end with the men inside that compartment. The sea surface was 50 meters away. Kefalonia was beyond that. Allied lines were further still. No one on the surface knew where to look, and no one was looking. Capes was not the only one who attempted the escape. The remembrance record is clear that 60 men were lost. The sources do not provide a full account of how many individuals attempted to use the DSEA sets or what happened to each of them during that sequence. What the record establishes is the outcome. One man reached the surface. The physical distance was 50 meters. The physiological demands were extreme. Pressure equalization, the buoyancy of the apparatus, the cold water temperature, the duration of the ascent, each was a separate variable that had to resolve in his favor. None of them were guaranteed, and none could be controlled from inside the compartment once the ascent began. Reaching the surface was not reaching safety. Capes surfaced in open water at night, in December, in the Ionian Sea, with enemy-controlled territory in every direction. Kefalonia was occupied by Italian forces at the time. The island itself represented both the only landmass within reach and a place where he could be captured immediately upon arrival. He swam to it. The sources do not specify the exact distance he covered in the water, but the wreck location places Perseus close enough to the island's coastline that the swim, though punishing given what had already happened, was not physically impossible. What happened on Kefalonia is documented in outline. Capes was sheltered by local people on the island. Under Italian occupation, concealing an Allied serviceman carried serious personal risk for anyone who provided that shelter. The records do not name those individuals or fully detail the circumstances of the period he spent hidden, and the sources do not support a more granular reconstruction. What is documented is that Capes remained on the island and was eventually able to return to Allied control. The exact route and timeline of that return are not specified in the available sources. The post-war examination of the wreck is an important part of why this case is treated as verified history rather than simply a claimed survival. Divers who reached Perseus were able to examine the DSEA equipment and the escape arrangements in detail. Elements of Capes' account, including the condition of the escape hatch and the equipment found at the site, were consistent with his reported escape. That physical corroboration does not resolve every detail of the sequence, but it establishes that the escape he described was physically plausible and that evidence at the site supported the core of what he said had happened. The medical consequences of what Capes endured that night would have been significant. A pressurized ascent of 50 meters using oxygen rebreather equipment, followed by cold water immersion, followed by a prolonged period of concealment in an occupied and uncertain environment, none of that leaves a body unchanged. The sources do not detail his specific injuries or the medical treatment he received after returning to Allied lines, and that portion of the account cannot be further reconstructed without going beyond what the evidence supports. What this case demonstrates, examined on its own terms, is the compounding nature of the constraints Capes faced and the extraordinarily narrow margin within which survival occurred. The mine strike gave no warning. The depth was at the boundary of what the escape equipment could theoretically handle. The surface offered no rescue. The nearest land was occupied territory, and yet the combination of a surviving air pocket, functional escape equipment, and one man's successful execution of the full escape sequence produced an outcome the physical odds had made almost impossible to expect. His account was doubted by some in the years immediately after the war. That skepticism was not unreasonable given how extreme the circumstances were. The wreck examination that followed gave the record something it had lacked: physical evidence that the escape had happened, and that the man who described it had told the truth about the essential elements. 60 names are recorded in the Book of Remembrance. John Capes returned. The distance between those two facts, 60 dead and 1 survivor, is measured in meters of cold water, a functioning piece of equipment, and a sequence of physical events that had to go exactly right when nothing else had. The Ionian Sea still holds the wreck of HMS Perseus at roughly 50 meters. The escape hatch, examined decades after the war, confirmed what one survivor had reported from the other side of it. That alignment between a man's account and the physical evidence left behind is, in the end, what moves this story from remarkable claim to documented history, and what makes the constraints he survived worth understanding on their exact, verified terms.